hopefully going to do a discussion on the decision by Thailand to purchase Chinese submarines. We hope we will be allowed to go ahead with it. We have a couple of speakers already lined up, and we're hoping to get a few more. The week after that, 7th of June, we hope to put on a panel discussion looking at land encroachment and the various moves the military authorities have done to seize back land in the last 3 years, where those seizures have been made, has it been fair, what's the issues on the ground there. Week after that, 14th of June, we will be looking at, we hope, the Thai economy. How well is it doing, and how well has it been doing in the last 3 years. Every Monday night, as usual, we have our film night. The next one coming up is next Monday. Is it next Monday? Yes, that will be next Monday. It's a documentary by Oscar-winning director Alex Gibney on Steve Jobs from Apple. The Monday after that, we have a documentary called 1971, which is about... I'm going to have to just read it out, because otherwise I won't know. 8 ordinary citizens break into an FBI office and make off with a whole bunch of files and hand them over to the public. So it's kind of like a pre-digital Edward Snowden-y type thing. As for tonight's talk, delighted to have Bill Hayton here. For anyone who's been in the region the last few years will probably know Bill. He was based in Vietnam for the BBC in the 2000s, where he wrote his first book, Vietnam Rising Dragon. More recently, he's been concentrating on the thorny issue of the South China Sea. Before his time in Asia, he was in both the Middle East and Central and Eastern Europe. And Bill also spent a year with MRTV, the Myanmar state broadcaster, helping train up. Great
success. You can see how brilliantly
the
state
it does stunning stuff.
Is now.
I was reading the Economist review of Bill's latest book on the South China Sea, and there was this one nice line that stood out, which said that he's the only writer who's managed to make a meeting of ASEAN states sound exciting. So as somebody who's had to do at least 2 ASEAN summits now, I'm very much looking forward to seeing what he has to say. Obviously, the South China Sea, it feels sometimes a bit remote when we're here in Thailand, because Thailand doesn't really have a dog in the fight. But for those of us, or anyone who's basically interested in the region, and particularly journalists who may be based here but report on the Asia-wide region, it's a story that constantly crops up. So Bill will explain now a lot about the history and what China's plan is for the future. Great. So I'll hand you over.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to everybody for coming. It's really great to be here, because I think this journey started about 11 years ago in this room, and probably meeting Jonathan actually over there before I started in Vietnam. Vietnam lasted a year before they got bored of my presence. And one thing led to another. It was really the Chinese that caused me to write this book, because I was looking for a topic in 2011, and that's when things started to hit the headlines. I'm going to try and tell you a bit about how the various countries came to claim bits of the South China Sea. I can't give you the whole history, obviously, because it's very, very long, but I'll do my best. What I want to try and prove to you is that the claiming the South China Sea was not a rational process. It's not some kind of clear-eyed decision by a series of governments. It's basically a story of cock-ups for about a century. And what we're left with is a legacy of a whole series of mistakes and accidents, which governments now try to present in some kind of rational light. So this is the kind of the gonzo theory of the South China Sea claims. I just always like to begin this just by making sure that everyone is clear that I'm not claiming to have done all of this research myself. I've used a lot of other people's work. Do I have a pointer or anything, just in case?
No, sorry.
Okay, there's the South China Sea, right? Okay. I'll point to 4 things.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, that's China, obviously. These are the Paracel Islands here. Okay, these are the Spratlys down here. That little bump there is the Scarborough Shoal, which is disputed only really between the Philippines and China. When I say China, in most of this I'm referring to both parts of China. There's a little feature called Paracels, which is very important at the beginning of the story, which is about there. Okay. So this is what we're talking about. These are the largest natural islands, as it were. For example, Titu, the one that's held by the Philippines, is not even large enough to fit a runway on it, sticks off both sides. Spratly Island, this is occupied by the Vietnamese. This has just got a bit bigger recently, slightly longer and slightly wider. This is the largest one, which has been controlled by Taiwan/Republic of China since 1946. And these are the smallest ones in their natural state. These two are held by China. These have both got significantly larger in the recent years. So Subi Reef now looks like that. That little blockhouse is that thing there. This is a runway that's 3 kilometers long, and this harbour is as large as the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii now. And this is really what it's all about. This is the U-shaped line. As you can see, the U-shaped line changes its shape depending on who draws it. So in 1947, when the Chinese map first appeared, it was these green dashes. And then in 2009, when the Chinese sent a map to the United Nations, it was the red dashes. In between times, 2 of the dashes got dropped by PRC, but Taiwan still puts these 2 dashes on the map, and there's another dash up here. So the number of dashes changes depending on who draws the map, so I tend to call it the U-shaped line. Right, anyone know where this is? This is officially the southernmost point of Chinese territory. And what's interesting about it is that there's nothing there. So the southernmost point of Chinese territory doesn't actually exist. But underneath that little bit of sea there is something called, in Chinese, the Zhengmu Ansha. And in English, it's called the James Shoal. And the first clue about the history of this feature is that in Chinese, Zhengmu is simply the transliteration of James, JM. Okay? So that was my first clue in trying to unravel why this is the southernmost bit of Chinese territory. But this is a Chinese flotilla on its way to do an anti-piracy patrol off Somalia, stopping, honouring the southernmost point of Chinese territory and chucking a concrete block into the sea just to prove that it's Chinese. And this is where the James Shoal is. It is there, okay? Which is obviously, you can see, an awfully long way from China. It's nothing to do with the continental shelf of China. You can see the continental shelf goes around the edge, and this is 5,000 feet deep in the middle. So how did this little blob come to be the southernmost point of Chinese territory? I will leave that hanging and give you the answer later on. Okay, you may have heard the phrase, since ancient times, that China has administered, occupied, developed, etc. the island since ancient times. Let's have a little look at the evidence. The book begins in a place called El Nido, which is on Palawan, northern tip of Palawan on here. In this place here, this is a limestone cliff tower, and at the bottom of this tower is a cave, and in the cave is a burial, about 5,000 years old. And this burial, according to the archaeologists, is in the shape of a boat, and the boat is sailing off into the darkness of the cave. And the person who was buried here was buried with baler shells, which, as the name implies, were used by people to bail out their canoes, and was also buried with a necklace of shells and teeth. And the archaeologists say that some of these shells came from what's now Vietnam, on the other side of the South China Sea, 5,000 years ago. So the point of this is to say that there were pre-existing sea gypsy type communities trading backwards and forwards across the South China Sea 5,000 years ago, in a very haphazard and semi-nomadic way. And we can still see the remnants of these kinds of communities kind of today. That's in Ha Long Bay in Vietnam. These people are living in off Hainan Island in southern China. But you can find Bajau in the Philippines, Orang Laut in Indonesia. These are Moken people off Burma, Myanmar. And you find these kind of semi-nomadic sea gypsy people living around. These were the first people that ever, discovered the islands of the South China Sea. And of course, they didn't care about territory or nations or anything like that. The next people really to come along and cross the sea in terms of trade were probably Malays, Indians, Gujaratis, Arabs, and Persians. If you go to Guangzhou, you can find a mosque that was built in the 7th or 8th centuries by Arabs and Persians that came from the Middle East to trade with China. And there are Chinese textual records of massacres of Arabs and Persians in southern China in the 8th and 9th centuries. So the first people that made long-distance trading really were probably from outside the region, were probably from the Middle East. Southeast Asia at the time specialized in basically being a kind of transit point. So you have, because of the change in the monsoon winds, people coming from the Middle East and wanting to go to China would have to stop for a few weeks or months waiting for the seasons to change. And that's basically what made places like Champa and Srivijaya and Malacca rich at various points in Southeast Asian history. And here's a little carving from Indonesia and Borobudur showing a traditional Southeast Asian ship with outriggers and so forth, a kind that's sort of familiar even today, really. The first evidence of any Chinese ship crossing the South China Sea doesn't exist until about the 10th century AD. So in terms of an actual wreck or some other kind of physical artifact, whereas there are these carvings and other evidence of Southeast Asian ships crossing the sea and Asian ships from much earlier. And what we do know about Chinese voyaging comes from things like this. This map was drawn in the 1970s, but based on a book which was navigational instructions that were drawn up around the time of Cheng He, whom you may have heard of. He's the eunuch admiral, famous 600 years later for having no testicles. He and his other admirals sailed as far as East Africa in the Indian Ocean, but these navigational instructions they left behind make it pretty clear that they didn't go and occupy islands. They were interested in trading around the edge of the South China Sea because that's where the ports are, that's where the markets are. The middle of the South China Sea is full of reefs and rocks and is very dangerous. You'd have to be very foolish to go and sail through it. So this evidence from Chinese sources basically says we didn't go through the middle of the sea. This is from about 200 years later. This map is in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. It was stolen by an English sea captain from a Chinese sea captain. But what was recently discovered is that on the map there are navigational chart lines, again showing routes going around the outside of the South China Sea. And one of the reasons why sailors avoided going directly through the middle was a belief that there was a chain of islands running. Oh, excuse me, help. Right, that one, don't I? Right, that there was a chain of islands running up the coast of Vietnam. This is from a Dutch map of 1630. This is a French map at the very end of the 18th century, and they both show the existence of a non-existent set of islands. And this is presumably information that these Europeans were picking up from local sources. Don't go that way, there are dangerous islands there. So up until the beginning of the 19th century, the traditional route was you either went that way or you hugged the Vietnamese coast and then went that way. You didn't sail directly across. Until the Brits get in on the act, and you get the East India Company in the 1800s starting to navigate the route to Canton much more accurately. And we can see the legacy of the East India Company in the names of the Paracel Islands. So Pattle, Roberts, Duncan, Drummond were all managers of the East India Company in the early part of the 19th century. But even at this stage, even though the Brits are mapping it and the French start to map it as well, it's largely an ungoverned sea. It doesn't really belong to anybody. As late as 1891, having famous pirate cases, there's even an after picture of this, which is more famous, of some Europeans resting after these guys have all had their heads cut off. But a typical Chinese map of 1897 shows no interest in any islands further south than Hainan here. they're not considered particularly important to anybody. But within 12 years of this map, the fate of South China Sea islands suddenly becomes of critical national importance. So what changes? Well, obviously, the century of humiliation is what happened. That period between 1840 and 1949, when the Western powers humiliated China, carved it up, and prompted nationalism and anti-Qing feeling and the birth of modern China. So the actual trigger event for what happened is the discovery of bird shit and guano as a significant agricultural fertilizer. Guano was a major cash commodity in the late 19th and early 20th century until the invention of some chemical process that I can't remember allowed artificial fertilizers to be made. But places, Nauru in the Pacific was the richest country on the planet for a few years before every single scrap of guano had been taken from it. And the Japanese in particular were out there looking for guano, and a guy called Nishizawa Yoshiji from Yokohama found guano on Pratas here. And of course, bear in mind that Japan is occupying Taiwan at this point, so it's not so far. So he is discovered, while the rumors reach the United States from Japan that this guy is digging up, he's doing something on Pratas, and the Americans become concerned because they have just acquired a colony in the Philippines. And so William Taft, who goes on to become president of the US later, but at this point is just Secretary of War, happens to be making a visit to Shanghai, and he tells the Chinese that the Japanese are up to something and asks them to go and investigate. So it's not that so much that China is administering these territories and finds out about the Japanese, so much as the Americans hear about a rumor and ask the Chinese to go and investigate. But it takes about a year, just over a year, for the Chinese authorities to then send a boat to investigate, and at that point it makes it into the newspapers. And I've traced this through the archives of the South China Morning Post and the Straits Times and some of the Chinese newspapers, and there are riots, there's anti-Japanese boycotts, there's all kinds of nationalist feeling, and the Qing authorities, Chinese government as was, feel under enormous pressure to stand up to the foreigners. So in response, they negotiate with Japan, and in the Chinese text it says that the force of public opinion forced the Japanese to recognize Chinese sovereignty. Well, yes, that, and the fact that China paid Japan 130,000 silver dollars for the territory, or in compensation to the businessmen. But anyway, Japan recognizes Chinese sovereignty over Pratas, but in the process of doing so, the admiral who's in charge of this expedition here also learns about the Paracel Islands down here, and in May, June 1909, organizes a very well-publicized expedition to the Paracels, including taking along a German radio engineer with them so that they can broadcast updates of what they're up to and the local newspapers can print it. It's very clearly a public relations exercise to kind of show that the Qing government is standing up to the foreigners. And they come back and they say they've claimed it, they plant flags in the islands, they fire cannon shots and everything, and then the first maps start to appear in 1909. With the Paracels on it. But almost immediately afterwards, the Chinese authorities lose interest in the Paracels. There's the final article I have seen, which is only a few weeks after this expedition took place, says that perhaps they're going to be used for a penal colony, because there have been these high hopes that there were going to be salt works and fishing and other stuff, but in the end they realized there were absolutely no economic value whatsoever. Now, very soon after that, you have the revolution in China, and a lot of things are happening simultaneously. But I'm going to kind of divert slightly now to talk about the problems that the Republic of China had in defining its borders. Because there was a sense that the foreigners had grabbed a lot of territory from China, and that this territory should rightfully be returned to China, but exactly what boundaries should modern China have? So this was the very first official map of the Republic of China published in the Almanac in 1912, and it shows no borders whatsoever. It shows roads and railways and rivers, but Vietnam and Korea are both described as originally our vassal, with the implication that perhaps they should be returned to China at some point. And this is this prompts a kind of genre of map making in China, the maps of national humiliation, and there are many, many, many examples of this. This says map of national humiliation up here. And the idea is that everything coloured in pink has been stolen by the foreigners, by the British, by the French, by the Japanese, by the Russians, and that this maybe should be returned to the Chinese people. Now, these maps are not produced by the government, they're produced by educators, nationalists, civil society people. This is the Shanghai Cartographic Society. This one, from a decade later, is a commercial publication by the Zhonghua Book Publishing Company, and whoever drew this map up had a much more expansive idea of where China's rightful territory should be, including the whole of Southeast Asia and bits of Afghanistan and Iran. And I imagine, based on this line, that what they're saying is that, for example, the Sulu Sultanate down here used to send tribute to the emperor in Beijing, so therefore it must have been part of a Chinese emperor a long time ago, so therefore it should be part of a Chinese empire or a Chinese state now. This again is not a state document, it was sold for nationalist education and for profit, but it shows that there are, so the inner line is basically saying this is the area of China as it is now, including the Paracel Islands, and this is where we think it should be. But it's not specifically aimed at the South China Sea, because it hasn't even marked the Spratly Islands, for example, down here. It's about other territories around it. Okay. That part of the story comes back in a minute. But in the 1920s, Japan is continuing to dig up guano for things like making phosphorus for matches, but agricultural fertilizer and stuff. There are various murky deals between Japanese businesses and Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen needs weapons to fight against the warlords in China. The Japanese want land and other deals. That part of the history is still pretty murky. So Japan is gradually expanding its influence in the South China Sea through guano. Meanwhile, France is obviously the imperial power in Indochina, and the Institute of Oceanography in Nha Trang on the Vietnamese coast is looking for budgets, and so the director of the institute basically tells the government in France that he's going to fly the flag for France in the South China Sea, and by the way, could he have a bit more budget for his institute? So the French claim really emerges out of this director wanting funding for his marine expeditions. But gradually, France and Japan start to kind of jockey for position in the islands, and China kind of, in the late 1920s, starts to get in on the act. Now, apologies for the next slide. It's got far too much information on it, but I'll just try and run through the thing. Okay, several things are happening at the same time in the late 1920s. So, 1928, Chiang Kai-shek finally unifies China after the Northern Expedition and starts to consolidate control over China. And one of the many things that he tries to do is to regularize the maps to try to end these arguments about where China's rightful borders lie. So he creates a committee, or his government creates a committee to inspect maps so that they will be one authoritative map of China. At the same time, the French are starting to get in on the act and demonstrate their interest in both the Paracels and the Spratlys, and Japan starts to invade Manchuria initially and then to attack other parts of China. So by the time we get to 1933, we've got sort of Franco-Japanese competition in the islands. We've got China under attack from Japan, and we've got the Chinese government trying to bureaucratize, trying to finally confirm the shape of the country. And then just as all this is happening, on Bastille Day 1933, the French government declares that it has annexed the Spratly Islands, or 6 of the Spratly Islands. I love this. It's kind of the bureaucracy of empire. So it's in a newspaper where they put, these are the names and the coordinates of the islands that we've just annexed. And then right here, there's something about the closure of the port of Boulogne, and something here about the regulation to do with the thickness of millstones, or something like that. And then we set in chain an international conflict in the other column. What I've discovered in my recent research is that at this point there is complete confusion in China because the Chinese are convinced that the islands that the French have annexed are the same ones that the Chinese claimed back in 1909. So there are kind of conversations at cross purposes. So the Chinese government is convinced that they're the Paracels, or the French government obviously knows that they're the Spratlys. And so the Chinese government asks its ambassadors, notably in Manila and in Paris, to find out what's going on. And so we have records from the American side of the Chinese ambassador in Manila going to the Americans in the Philippines and saying, can we have a map so that you can tell us which islands the French have annexed? And what's happening, eventually within 10 days, a couple of weeks, the government in Nanjing, the official Chinese government in Nanjing, becomes convinced that, that these are not the same islands that China claimed in 1909. However, there is a rival Chinese government based in Canton in Guangzhou, the anti-Chiang Kai-shek government, which is not convinced, and is convinced, in fact, that they're the same islands and that the Nanjing government is selling China out and continues to agitate. And this confusion about which islands the French have annexed, whether they're Chinese or not, continues to haunt the Chinese discussions ever since. It's made worse by the fact that the admiral that commanded the expedition back in 1909 pops up, writes another newspaper article in 1933 and says, yes, these are definitely the same islands. The problem is that the newspaper and magazine articles that are written in this time then become the standard works for writing the history of the South China Sea disputes, first in Chinese, and then in the 1970s they're translated into English. And so what I've had to do is kind of go back through the way these histories have been written to realize that it's the confused accounts of the history that were written this year in 1933 which have basically messed up the history writing of the South China Sea ever since for the last 80-odd years or so. Right. So this then, partly because of this confusion, the Chinese government says, right, okay, we really are going to regularize the maps, not just of the land, but also of the South China Sea. And we're going to name them, we're going to have an agreed map and so forth. And this starts to happen during early 1930s, 1933. But what's strange about this is that the Chinese, for example, fishermen who use the islands must have had their own names for some of these islands. Maybe not for all of them, but for some of them. But the committee that comes up with the Chinese names doesn't use those kind of names. It simply takes the British names from the British maps and translates them into Chinese. So this is from a Chinese list. Basically, in 1935, this government committee comes up with a list of names, which are subsequently adjusted in 1947 and again in 1983. But let's concentrate here. And you can see that the English name is North Danger. The Chinese name is Beixian. Guess what it means? North Danger. Yeah? Spratly, named after Captain Richard Spratly, the guy who claimed to have discovered it in 1843. Sibalade. Yeah? Spratly. That's the Chinese transliteration. Yeah? Antelope Reef. There are no antelopes living on that reef. Lin Yangjiao. Antelope Reef. It was the British ship, the Antelope, that mapped it in 1810. My favorite one, Jinyin Dao. Okay, Jinyin in Chinese means money. All right, still the modern name, okay? Okay, that's William Taylor Money. All right, he's a manager of the East India Company. So to this day, the Chinese name for one of the Paracel Islands honors a British imperialist. Thank you, China. So the rest of the list, I was trying to work out which document it came from. There are a number of mistakes on the Chinese list, and using the power of Google Books, I simply typed those mistakes in and discovered that there's only one likely source for it, which was the China Sea Directory, published by the UK Hydrographic Office in 1906. And they simply copied the list of names out of this thing, gave them Chinese versions, and made them Chinese. So they then, in 1935, published a map, with a Chinese map, showing these islands with their Chinese names in these places. But what's interesting, if you know the history now, so Pratas here is known in Chinese as Dongsha, which means the eastern sand. The Paracels here are known in Chinese as Xisha, the western sand. That was a name that was given in 1909 as a kind of mirror image, Dongsha, Xisha. And in 1935, this area here, known in English as the Macclesfield Bank, was called Nansha, the southern sand. So you have, west, east, and south. Now, these days, modern times, the Chinese refer to the Spratlys as the Nansha, because this is now the southern features that China claimed. But back in 1935, these were called the Nansha because China only claimed this far south. Something changed. Now, this is the James Shoal. It makes a sort of sudden appearance at the bottom of the map down here. Now, why does the James Shoal get an appearance? It's a kind of complicated story. One of the reasons is that when they first translated the name of the feature, they used the Chinese word, the word for shoal that they chose. And the shoal is an old English word that means shallow. But the Chinese committee translated it with the Chinese word tan. So written in traditional Chinese, zheng mu tan. Tan is the Chinese word for a sandbank, i.e. something that you can stand on. So because of a translation mistake in 1935, a piece of seabed became an island. And because it became an island, it then became territory and it could then become claimed. It's because of a translation mistake. So, but why do they pick on the James Shoal? If you look at any modern navigational chart of the South China Sea, the James Shoal is just one of many underwater features in this area. I think, and this is just a hypothesis, that once again they copied a British map. And this map was published in London by Stanford in 1918, and it gives particular prominence to the James Shoal and also to the Vanguard Bank up here off Vietnam. But it marks them with dotted lines that we would understand today to be like an underwater feature here. And you can see here in this list the Zhengmu Tan here. In 1947, the name was changed to Zhengmu Ansha. Ansha means hidden sand, which is a better translation of shoal. But by then, the map making had been done. So enter this guy here, Bai Mei Chu, founder of the China Geographical Society, who in 1936 takes the information from this Chinese government committee and publishes his own commercially available atlas, taking, for the very first time, a Chinese claim down to the Zhengmu Tan. And you'll see what he's done is he's filled in the dotted line and turned it into a solid line and coloured it in so it becomes an island. And he also invents a few other non-existent islands up here in the Macclesfield Bank. And then he draws his big red line around here. This is where the U-shaped line emerges in a privately produced atlas in 1936. But this is his own thoughts. This is not the Chinese government at this point. And we can be pretty sure of that because in 1943, in the middle of the Second World War, the Chinese government produced what it calls the China Handbook. This was published by the Ministry of Information. This first edition was in Calcutta. It produces another one in New York. And on, I think, page 1, it tells you how big China is, and it clearly states it goes all the way from the north up there to the Paracel Islands in 1943. Okay? This is obviously different to what China claims today. You may have heard of the Cairo Declaration. The Cairo Declaration says nothing at all about the Paracels and the Spratlys. I think deliberately so. It specifically names Manchuria, Formosa, i.e. Taiwan, and the Pescadores, which are close to the coast of Taiwan. And it says that they shall be restored to China. Full stop, new sentence. Japan will also be expelled from all the other territories which has been taken by violence and greed, but clearly doesn't allocate them to any power. Partly, I imagine, because the French were keen to get them back. And so the Americans didn't want to annoy either the Chinese or the French by promising them to one or the other. The US tested napalm on Itu Aba during the Second World War. These are pictures of the bombing raid on the 1st of May 1945, after which, as far as I can tell, the Japanese were either all killed or evacuated the island because it was empty for about a year, as far as I can tell, after this bombing raid. Then what happens is a couple, remember I mentioned Bai Mei Chu, the geography professor? Well, a couple of his students go on to become geography professors in turn, including this guy. And in 1946, straight after the end of the Second World War, he and the other former students are hired by the Chinese government to draw up the map which China will then use to claim the islands and define its territories after the Second World War. So he, it seems, takes the ideas of his professor, Bai Mei Chu, from the geography classroom into the corridors of the government. You can see him, he joins the Chinese expedition to the islands in 1946. this is kind of made more urgent by the fact that when the Philippines becomes independent in July 46, they start to talk about making a claim to the islands as well. This is the very first map, as far as I can tell, where a line is marked on a map produced by a Chinese government department, and it was produced for an internal meeting in September 1946. And really, the point of this line is simply to show which islands China claims. It's not supposed to say that it claims the whole sea. But even here, there's a bit of confusion about the name of the James Shoal down here. They get the name wrong, basically. But this is never published, this map. I just discovered it in the Taiwanese archives. Well, actually, sorry, my research assistant discovered it in the Taiwanese archives. In 1946, in December, this is the very first time that any Chinese official ever landed in the Spratly Islands, 12th of December 1946. And they plant the flag and they claim it for China. They were actually a few months after the French had arrived back, and they claimed it in October. In the Paracels, at the other end of the South China Sea, there was another French-Chinese scramble, and there the Chinese got there first and occupied the eastern half of the Paracels, and the French were in the western half of the Paracels. The only reason that these expeditions were possible was because the Americans had just given the Chinese Navy some ships. So the Taiping used to be called the USS Decca. So it's kind of ironic that if the American Navy hadn't given China these ships, there wouldn't be a dispute in the South China Sea today, possibly. So after all of this map making at the end of, in late 1946, early 1947, this is the official map of the U-shaped line which was defined by the Republic of China, with a very similar line to that one you saw earlier. But now some of the names have been adjusted, so Spratly is no longer Sibalade, but is given a sort of artificial name of Nanwei, Noble South. And the Scarborough Shoal changes its name from Sigurbaolo, Scarborough, to Minju, Democracy Reef. But the Beijing government doesn't like the name Democracy Reef, so in 1983 they changed its name to Huangyan, which means yellow rock, which is a bit boring. But these by now have become, the Nansha has now moved south. These are no longer, this is now the Zhongsha, the central sands, and this is now the Nansha, the southern sands. But there's still a bit of confusion about the name of the James Shoal, so they put both names in the map in brackets down there. And then, I haven't got the slide here, but in 1947, a second edition of that China handbook is published, in which page 1, the opening paragraph is changed to say that the China now extends all the way from the mountains in the north down to the islands in the south. But this time it's still calling them the Tuansha. So my summary of the Chinese claim is it's basically a cock-up. It was a series of ideas about kind of China's traditional zone of influence, which were then kind of bits of wishful thinking, bits of mistranslation, bits of dodgy map making, and that's the claim that we've ended up today. Now I'll quickly whiz through a couple of the others in briefer time. The Vietnamese claim that Emperor Zalong created an organization to salvage cannon from wrecks of foreign ships in the Paracel Islands and administered, in effect, the islands in the early 20th century. The problem is that the Vietnamese have put every single document relating to this period under lock and key, so it's really hard to verify very much this. Pretty much every single old map in Vietnam is now impossible to access, probably because they don't show islands. And therefore the Vietnamese are paranoid that the Chinese will find a map that doesn't show an island and say, look, even the Vietnamese didn't know these islands were there, in reverse. However, I mean, it's clear that the French did annex the islands in the early 20th century, and the question becomes a legal one as whether Vietnam inherits that claim or not. Vietnam really occupies them, begins to occupy them in 1956, and I'll talk about why in a second. And then in the 70s, the interest in the South China Sea moves from guano to oil, because, among other things, the British government funds a survey of the South China Sea which indicates possible oil reserves. And so then suddenly everybody gets interested in South China Sea again in the early 1970s. The Philippines claim has a very wonky beginning. I mean, under the American, in the American period, there are various acts of administration. For example, you know, the salvaging of a ship in 1913 and so forth, whereby the Philippines can say that the Americans were actually occupying, well, not occupying, but were administering the islands in effect. But again, that's a question for the international lawyers. For us, there's a better story here, which begins in 1956, which is when this guy, Thomas Clomer, one might call him an entrepreneur, but one might also call him a smuggler or a kind of dodgy dealer. He goes and claims the islands, not for the Philippines, but for himself. He sets up his own country called Freedom Land, and there's some evidence to suggest that he had been involved in smuggling during the Second World War, and he and his brother, you know, were transiting contraband through the islands. He was enough of a lawyer to know that Japan had relinquished its claim to the islands in the San Francisco Peace Conference. So he basically said, well, if Japan's relinquished its claim, then nobody claims them, so now I can claim them. And he sets up his own country, prints postage stamps, goes and issues a declaration, marches up and down the main street in Manila, and I just thought he was a bit of a clown when I first came across it. But then what he did was to prompt Taiwan and Vietnam and France and China to suddenly start restating their claims again in the middle of the 1950s. So that's when the kind of the reoccupations of these islands begin again in 1956. But then it all goes quiet again until oil is discovered, and then Marcos sends in the Marines to 7 islands in the early 1970s, at which point Thomas Clomer pops up and says, these are my islands, and I want you, Mr. Marcos, to pay me for my islands. So Marcos invites him to the palace and sticks him in prison for 70 days, confiscates all his ships, and only lets him out when Clomer signs over the islands to the Philippines for 1 peso. And unfortunately he died, still demanding further compensation a few years later. But until recently, the Philippines claim was based on the idea that Thomas Clomer discovered the islands in 1956. They've got it on a bit more of a sound legal basis since then. Oil also prompted, oil plus the bad relations between China and the Soviet Union in the 70s prompted China, mainland China, communist China, which was already occupying the eastern half of the Paracels, to invade the western half of the Paracels in 1974, kick out the South Vietnamese. And it's worth remembering at this point that Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, was an American ally at this point, and yet the United States stood aside and allowed the Chinese to invade the Paracels and kick its ally out. So I think this is a good example of how, you know, the US at the end of the Second World War took a decision to be neutral on the territorial claims, and has been neutral. It clearly, you know, it didn't even take the side of its ally in 1974. 20 years later, in 1994, China occupied Mischief Reef under the noses of another American treaty ally, the Philippines. Again, the US did nothing at all. So I think it is fair to say that the US has remained neutral on the territorial question for most of the last 70 years. The next people to get in on the act were the Malaysians. That's what Swallow Reef looked like before. That's what it looks like now. So the Malaysians were the first to really concretize some of these reefs. This is the only one that you can visit as a civilian. So this is a diving resort here, Leang Leang, Swallow Reef. So this is a kind of military runway, but you can go scuba diving off there. And they occupy now five features. Now, it was now time for the mainland China to get in on the act. So they already had occupied the Paracels since '74, but they had no possessions in the Spratlys. Taiwan occupied the biggest, Itu Aba. So the Chinese arrived literally with a bang in 1988. They grabbed 1 reef under the noses of the Vietnamese, who were too slow to react. And then one morning in March 1988, they moved on 3 reefs simultaneously. The Vietnamese got to 2 of them first, but on Johnson Reef, both the Chinese and the Vietnamese landed at the same time. There was literally a fist fight between the Marines on the Johnson Reef south. And then the Chinese withdrew, and as the tide rose around the legs of the Vietnamese Marines, the Chinese machine gunned a lot of them. And so you can see 64 people, I think, were killed in this. And amazingly, the Chinese Navy filmed the whole thing. And a few years ago, a program on Chinese television, honouring I think it was something like the 60th anniversary of the PLA Navy, played the film. So the film is now available on YouTube, should you want to watch a lot of people getting machine gunned while standing up to their knees in water. So this is the current situation. And what people tend to forget, among all the publicity about China's massive bases, is that actually Vietnam occupies more than half of the features in the Spratly Islands. All of the paracels are occupied by China, or under the control of China. Taiwan occupies Itu Aba, the largest one there, in the middle. And then PRC occupies, so Mischief Reef is the closest one to the Philippines there. That's now a runway. Fiery Cross Reef is a runway. Subi Reef there is a runway. So you can see the runways, the big ones, are kind of in a very strategic triangle there, and then the smaller ones have just got radars on. The Malaysians are down here, and the Philippines have got a kind of scattering here. Second Thomas Shoal, you may have seen that there was that fantastic New York Times online piece, Game of Shark and Minnow. That's the one that has the rusting ship literally kind of collapsing into the sea, and there are 5 Philippine Marines kind of living on it. What does the U-shaped line mean? Nobody knows. In 2009, this is what really kicked off the South China Sea disputes recently. There was a process, a UN-sponsored process for countries with claims to continental shelves to formally define those claims and to send them to the United Nations, and that deadline was May 2009. Vietnam and Malaysia put together a joint submission for their bit of the sea down here and sent it off, and in response to that, the Chinese sent their own protest, and they attached this map with the U-shaped line with the ambiguous phrase, jurisdiction over the relevant waters. Now this phrase, relevant waters, you see in so many Chinese statements. Nobody knows what it means, and they also use adjacent waters. Adjacent to what? Nobody knows, and they won't define it. So this was basically the first time that the U-shaped line had been submitted to an international body. So this is really what started to alarm Southeast Asian countries in 2009. In 2012, China put out a series of oil blocks to tender. They'd already, I won't go into the story, but back in 1992, an American oil man persuaded China to give him the rights to this bit of seabed off the coast of Vietnam, which is a story in itself. Chapter 5 in the book, well worth reading. So basically what they're saying here, in effect, is that China has the rights to these blocks of seabed off the Vietnamese coast, i.e. implying that the U-shaped line is a claim on all the oil and gas within it. This is about, that's about Coast Guard voyages. A similar thing, that the Coast Guard acts as if it owns the South China Sea. And fishing regulations proposed by Hainan province 3 years ago actually offer ships, fishermen, extra subsidies if they go fishing within the 9-dash line. So here you have Hainan province, not the central government, but a province, using the 9-dash line as a boundary, in effect, for fishing rights and so forth. So, I mean, the best indication of what the meaning of the line is a kind of 3-part thing, which is, one, it indicates that China claims every rock reef and island within it, that China claims rights ascribed to it in the law of the sea, i.e. Exclusive economic zone and that kind of thing, measured from the islands. And you can kind of argue with those, but at least they're done within the standard rubric of international law. The third part is that China claims historic rights within the whole of the U-shaped line, historic rights to fish, historic rights to oil and gas, and historic rights to regulate and intercept navigation. So those are the bits. That's the third part of the claim, which everybody else finds objectionable. Just to show how kind of the 9-dash line itself has a kind of particular, almost religious power. So here's Vietnam, here's Hainan Island, here are the Paracels. In 2000, China and Vietnam agreed a maritime boundary in the Gulf of Tonkin down to this point here. Now, at this point here in the sea, it becomes important as to who has the sovereignty over the Paracel Islands, as to whether a boundary would, if these are Vietnamese, the boundary would go that way. If they're Chinese, the boundary would go that way. But this stretch of the boundary here is undefined, and yet it should be really easy to find. There's no question of territorial claims here, this red bit here. The problem is that there is one dash of the 9-dash line here, and the Chinese are well aware that if they agree this, then they are rubbing out this line. And if you can rub out one dash, well, why can't you rub out all of them? Yeah. So the Vietnamese are trying. I mean, they're in talks right now, which are going nowhere because the Vietnamese are trying to stretch this line this way, and the Chinese are trying to stretch the line that way and kind of create an area of joint development here. And the Vietnamese are not having any of it. So you'd have thought this would be very easy for them to sort out, but they can't because of the magic properties of this dash here. Down at the other end of the South China Sea, this is Natuna, one of the tiny Indonesian island. Indonesia claims an exclusive economic zone like that, but of course the U-shaped line comes down here, and so that bit in the middle is where the trouble happens between, well, some of the trouble happens between Indonesia and China, fishing boats and that kind of thing. Now the Indonesians are particularly head in the sand about this. I've actually had an Indonesian diplomat tell me that, okay, there's a dash there and a dash there, but we don't know where the dash line goes in between. Maybe it's a zigzag. Literally, he said, maybe it's a zigzag. Yes, right. So the Indonesians pretend they haven't got a dispute with China, but of course they have got a dispute with China. These I think are the next likely spots of contention. So you probably aware recently that President Duterte said that President Xi threatened him with war if the Philippines drilled for gas. Well, on the Reed Bank, that's where the Reed Bank is about there. The Vietnamese have, both China and Vietnam have sold the rights for oil drilling in this part of the sea here to rival companies. This has been drilled by Talisman, which was then taken over by the Spanish company Repsol. But there's a Chinese company that also has the rights for the same bit of seabed, and the James Shoal down here. Now, the reason why this is important, 1/3 of the electricity for Luzon and Manila comes from a gas field, which is turned into electricity, called Malampaya, which is about here, just outside the U-shaped line. That's due to run out in about 10 years or less. So it's possible, the Philippines can just go and buy gas on the open market, but they've got a bloody enormous gas field right here, which they want to go and drill. And that was the whole purpose why they took China to the arbitration tribunal 4 years ago. That tribunal ruled last July, and that tribunal said, yep, no doubt about it. The only country with any rights to that gas is the Philippines. But that's obviously not how the Chinese see it. So the Philippines has a piece of paper. And had the election outcome been different last year, you'd have had, and if there'd been a sort of more pro-American leader, you could probably have seen discussions with the US about possibly protecting some kind of Philippines gas exploration there. Instead, we've got Duterte and we've got discussions about possible joint development going on there. But since the Philippine Constitution prohibits joint development in such circumstances, I don't think that's going to happen either. So the ruling that came out on the 12th of July delivered absolute legal clarity. If you think law is important, you'll love this, but if you think politics and force is more important, then you'll just tear your hair out. So what it said basically was that there are no islands in the South China Sea. All we have is insular features, rocks and reefs. And this is important because if an island can sustain human habitation or an economic life, then it gets an exclusive economic zone of up to 200 nautical miles drawn around it. Whereas if it's just a rock, then all you get is 12 nautical miles of territory. So in effect, this is what the ruling did. So there's the 9-dash line, U-shaped line drawn there, and it basically said, right, all we have is a series of rocks, little 12 nautical mile circles drawn around them, little donuts, and in effect, the court didn't rule on territory. It simply said these are areas of disputed territory over which we can make no ruling. However, outside of these areas, but within 200 nautical miles of the Philippines coast, everything, all the fish and all the oil and gas in there, the rights to those belongs to the Philippines. I mean, in theory, it should apply to other countries, but because the case is only between China and the Philippines, it only applies to those two countries. I mean, the principle is there, but there would have to be a separate proceeding for Vietnam to be able, or Brunei or any other country to claim the benefits. And so, in effect, you know, the Reed Bank is kind of about here. The Philippines has a piece of paper that says they can drill, but China is claiming sort of rights to it and is busy employing lawyers and legal students and people thinking of new and interesting formulations of international law which would allow them to go beyond what's in UNCLOS. UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. An answer to the question, there isn't one. Nobody owns the sea. Okay, under UNCLOS, which was negotiated for 9 years between 1973 and 1982, countries agreed that you can own up to 12 nautical miles away from your coast or from an island, and after that, you can't. Nobody owns it. But China is trying to think of imaginative interpretations whereby they can own at least rights to the sea well beyond what was allowed in UNCLOS. So it's worth remembering there are two sets of disputes in the South China Sea. There are disputes about the islands, which just involve the countries around the coast of the South China Sea, and there are disputes about the spaces in between the islands. And it's the spaces in between the islands, the rule of law, UNCLOS, what applies, that involve the United States and Japan, and what make the disputes potentially explosive, because when they start to overlap, then big countries care about what happens to tiny, otherwise insignificant features. So this time last year, so we are informed by leaks from Washington, the United States deployed A-10 attack aircraft to the Philippines and made clear that to China, quietly, diplomatically, that if China attempted to dredge and build on the Scarborough Shoal, the Americans would shoot the ships in the water, because they thought that China building a large runway and a base on the third point of a triangle, so let's go back a couple of slides. So at the moment, the Chinese have got bases in the Paracels and in the Spratlys down here, and if they got the third point of the triangle, then they could effectively control the South China Sea. The Japanese in particular think that the reason that the Chinese want to do this is to hide their ballistic missile submarines in the deep water here. And the ballistic missile submarines are based at Yulin Sanya Harbour up here. So it seems pretty good theory that this is the kind of the ultimate Chinese game, is to sort of have an iron triangle here protected by large island bases. So the Navy persuaded the White House that this would be a very bad thing, and the Obama administration threatened Beijing with violence very politely and diplomatically. So that was really the first time that the Americans, while not actually taking sides on who was the rightful owner of the Scarborough Shoal, basically said, you are not going to build on it. We wait to see whether that stance continues under the new team. I think the real problem in terms of resolving the disputes is that all of the claimants frame their claims to the islands in terms of entire island groups. So like the Chinese claim the Xisha and the Nansha. The Vietnamese claim the Hoang Sa and the Chuang Sa, and the Philippines claims the Calayan, which is basically all the Spratlys minus Spratly Island itself. If they were prepared to break their claims down into individual rocks and features, it would be relatively simple to show which country stuck its flag in which feature first. Taiwan would get Itu Aba, T2 would go to the Philippines, Spratly would go to Vietnam, and the rest, you know, we can argue about. But it's far too difficult for any of the states to climb down. I once had a lunch with people from both the Vietnamese and the Philippines foreign ministries, and I said, look, you know, kind of, you're in a situation now where both of your populations are pretty sympathetic to one another, and you both have a common enemy in the form of China. Wouldn't this now be the point where you two countries could settle your disputes and agree to recognize each other's claims? And that neither of them was prepared to admit that that was even politically possible. So, you know, but at the same time, Southeast Asian states have signed the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties, which basically makes clear that no one is going to try and force anybody else off these islands. So in effect, de facto, they have recognized the other country's possessions, but they can't do so legally. Is Vietnam prepared to reconcile itself to the loss of the Spratly, of the Paracel Islands in exchange for a reduction of Chinese claims in the Spratly Islands? There's no sign of that either. So, I mean, you know, the logical solution is simply everybody keeps what they've got, everybody recognizes that the law of the sea, UNCLOS, applies, everybody goes home. Yeah, but things ain't that simple, are they? advert coming up. Over there. All right, that'll do.
Bill, thanks very much for that. We'll open up the floor for questions. Please stick to questions rather than statements. And the microphone's just up there. Oh, please also state your name and your affiliation if you have one.
Hello, thank you very much. Oliver Holmes from The Guardian. Can you just talk briefly about how significant the current time is within the history of the South China Sea? Just over the past 2 years, we've seen the satellite images. Every 3 months they come out, and there's been huge developments, new runways, new bomber hangars. How significant is the current period, and you know, in all your research, how do you see the next 2 years panning out?
Right. I think the bad news for us journalists is that I think I see a period of peace and stability for the next year at least. Anyway, sorry about that. We'll have to manufacture our stories some other way. I mean, in the run-up to the Communist Party Congress in October, the fact that China wants Southeast Asian countries to buy into Belt and Road, the fact that they're negotiating RCEP at the moment, all tells me or suggests to me that they want to kind of keep things calm. The charm offensive will continue. The other thing is that they rarely press the East China Sea pedal at the same time as the South China Sea. At the moment, the Japanese are getting it, which means it's all quiet in the South China Sea. So, we'll wait for the thing to shift. The latest imagery suggests they're going to finish building the islands. They finished building the actual artificial islands themselves, but they're going to finish the construction relatively soon. It's worth remembering, in all of this, that China hasn't occupied any new territory since 1994. Yeah, so the artificial islands were built on features that China occupied mainly in 1988, but with one exception, Mischief Reef in 94. Which is why the US wasn't going to start interdicting dredging ships, because there had been no change in the territorial status. Obviously, what has changed is a massive change in terms of the Chinese capabilities. And I mean, I think there are good strategic reasons why they would want to do it. They want to protect the sea for submarines. They want to project power closer down to the Malacca Straits this way, in case the Americans ever tried to kind of impose some kind of sea blockade. They want to isolate Taiwan up here. They want to protect the coastal cities of China. So there are sort of, sound, rational reasons, but underlying it all is the sense that, this is Chinese territory, we own it, and we're going to make sure you're not going to put us out of it. The discussion about militarization, are they going to militarize the islands? Well, of course they're going to militarize the islands. They're just going to wait for a good excuse to do so. So, I mean, they've flown civilian airliners down there just to prove that the runways work. They've obviously got naval warships docking there regularly. When we talk about militarization, so the Obama administration called on China not to militarize. What they really meant was jet fighters and long-range missiles, which haven't appeared yet. As you say, the runway, the hangars are there, and as CSIS pointed out, 14 hangars plus 3 large hangars is exactly the size of a standard PLA naval aviation regiment. 14 fighters, a transport plane, a refueling plane, and a surveillance plane. Yeah, that's your standard naval aviation regiment. So they're all ready. They've got 3, pretty much ready to go. But then what they've got is a massive logistical headache, because there's no point having an air base there unless it has fuel to fuel the aeroplanes, yeah? So how are you going to get the fuel all the way down there? You're going to have a kind of very long supply chain, kind of from the coast, shipping aviation fuel down to these islands. These islands are regularly hit by typhoons. These islands are tiny, and they're surrounded by an awful lot of salty water, so the aeroplanes are going to rust, so you can't base them there permanently. So these things, it's very unlikely that they will base them there in the long term, but they will be there to be used in a crisis. So, for example, if they decide they are going to try and grab the gas from under the Philippines' noses here, then they will be able to have 24-hour jet fighter cover and, you know, surveillance and everything else that they need, should they wish to do so. But I don't see them sticking there on a regular basis. Now, the National Institute for South China Sea Studies, which is the Hainan province, and the Foreign Ministry, the Chinese Foreign Ministry's kind of PR arm when it comes to South China Sea stuff, has been going around Europe basically warning or telling, you know, think tanks and people that China won't militarize the islands so long as the Americans don't go there. But we all know the Americans are going to go there because they go there all the time. So what they're kind of preparing the ground for is some kind of response, so that the US will conduct some kind of freedom of navigation operation, and the Chinese will then say, oh look, you're militarizing, so now we're going to deploy our naval aviation regiment down there. So it will be presented in that way. But it will happen at a politically opportune time. And maybe, you know, while everyone's being nice to each other about North Korea at the moment, it won't happen now. I mean, it was interesting that when, you know, the whole thing about the whether or not the American aircraft carrier was really going to Korea, when in fact it was going the opposite way down in Australia, that when it went from Australia to Korea, it didn't go through the South China Sea. So it actually went out of its way to not go through the South China Sea. So was that Trump kind of bowing to the wishes of China and not trying to raise the tension in the South China Sea, or was that just some other, you know, naval calculation? So it kind of, you know, it seems that, you know, Trump's focus on North Korea, he has sort of actually done less to assert the American naval presence in South China Sea than Obama did, and we all know what Trump was saying about Obama's lack of assertiveness during the election campaign. Another U-turn.
Hi, I'm also Matthew Holmes. I am not a journalist and not affiliated.
Do they let you in?
They do let me in. I have to pay money, but yeah, my interest is that I lived in China for some time and worked for a number of state-owned companies, including CNOC, at certain points. And to some extent, you've already answered my question, which was really that to what extent are these issues to do with oil and resources, and to what extent are they to do with strategic issues, and particularly Taiwan, which most Chinese still feel is a sort of deep threat to them in terms of supply lines. I have so this more of a statement than a question, but so you might want to talk more about that. But also, I wanted to ask about reports about possible building of nuclear facilities in the South China Sea, which has been mentioned in some contexts.
I think, in terms of, you know, China's motivations, it's really all of the above. I mean, and I think one of the reasons why the state's push has been so determined is that it has united all kinds of interest groups, you know, from the fishing industry to the oil industry to the Navy and the Coast Guard, all of whom have a direct financial interest in maximizing the Chinese claim, you know, for fishing subsidies, for a budget for the Navy or whatever, or, you know, the income of coastal provinces. So yeah, resource questions are really important, and strategic issues, I think, are also, you know, a definite factor in there. The more that, you know, American thinkers talk about offshore defense and that sort of thing, offshore control as a strategy to fight China in a war, in terms of actually, you know, imposing a sea blockade on China, the more Chinese naval strategists want to build big secure bases in places like this. But I think underlying it all is the nationalist sense that this is rightfully our territory, that you know, China's not doing anything wrong by doing this, because every Chinese schoolchild is brought up to be taught that the James Shoal is the southernmost point of Chinese territory. I mean, I've seen maps from Chinese geography textbooks, and I'm told that one of the things you do in a 8th grade lesson is you measure from the Mongolian border down to the James Shoal and to work out how big China is. So kind of every, you know, child is taught that this is, you know, China's territory since ancient times. So there's no sense in that China's doing anything wrong, and so these things are always presented internally as righting a historic wrong, that the Vietnamese or the Philippines or whatever have stolen China's islands, so everything is a step back towards regaining China's territory. So you know, all of the above, and it's very hard to sort of prioritize one over the other. But if you think about what I was saying about the nuclear missile submarines, and if you remember that the purpose of the People's Liberation Army is not to protect the state, but to protect the Communist Party, then you see the second strike capability represented by the ballistic missile submarines as the final deterrent protecting the communist leadership. Then you can kind of see that they're quite keen to maintain this as a strategic bastion for the nuclear submarines.
Next question.
I'm Andrew Silver, retired un-American. I have a two-part question. First part is just, can you repeat who it was that wants to build a penal colony in the Paracel Islands? I missed that. Second part is, would they really have no economic value? What about fish, oil, gas, other kinds of sea resources?
Great, thank you. You might have to enjoy a picture of my children briefly, right? As I don't know. For some reason, they're not on the presentation, but just whenever I show that slide, they always pop up. I haven't quite worked out why. Right, right. This is just a little bit of evidence about the penal colony thing. Yeah. So this is from the South China Morning Post of June the 21st, 1909. So this is a couple of weeks after that expedition, that Chinese expedition came back from sticking the Chinese flag in the Paracel Islands in 1909. And, they went up with such high hopes. And then, they're saying, it's reported the authorities in Guangdong, Guangdong, proposed converting the inhabitable portions of the Paracel into a penal settlement with convicts to employ in agriculture. So basically, they went out and they sent 100 people, including senior officials, the salt commissioner, the taxation commissioner. They all went on these boats and it was going to be the great colonizing experiment, for China. And then within 2 weeks, they were, all these dreams were shattered, and they were talking about turning them to a penal settlement, and even that never happened. So basically, China then completely lost interest in the Paracel Islands for about a decade afterwards, as far as I can tell. So much so that I put this is from the Morning Post of 1920, and you've basically got shipping businesses still complaining, why is nobody building a lighthouse on the Paracels? We're still getting ships wrecked there. Why won't someone pay any attention to the Paracels whatsoever? So in international law, it's one thing to go and stick your flag in a place and say it's ours, but you then have to maintain your occupation afterwards and to kind of prove. So, for example, there is an island off the Pacific coast of Mexico. I think it's called Clipperton Island, which belongs to France. Nobody lives there. The Mexicans claim they put their flag in it. But the French claim that they went and visited it every year. So in the legal judgments, I think it was the Pope actually, or Emperor somebody of Italy, awarded the island to France on the grounds that the French went and visited it every year. So that same kind of question of ownership arises here. It's not enough to just go and stick your flag in it once and then leave. You've got to kind of maintain your occupation. So there was no economic value in the Paracels. China lost interest in the course of the revolution. Even more tragic, actually, in the case of Paracels Islands, which I was talking about. They were mining guano, and then during the 1911 revolution, everybody forgot about the people on Paracels, and they all starved to death. So the kind of interest in the offshore islands was very, very fleeting in response to these political protests. And the second part of the question, can someone remind me?
It was. They really have no economic value.
Yeah. I mean, well, they are. I mean, they have been used, as a source of as fishing grounds since time immemorial by coastal fishermen. China has drastically overfished its inshore waters, and that's one of the reasons why it has subsidized fishermen to go further into the disputed parts, because there aren't enough fish closer to the coast. It's interesting that China's fish catch, the target that was set by the government was 12 million tons a year. And with remarkable consistency, it hit the target every year. Any suggestion that they may have been manipulating the figures in order to meet Communist Party targets is obviously a grotesque slander. But they've now reduced the fishing targets to 10 million tons, suggesting that they're getting the message that these areas are overfished and that they need to do something about it. Whether or not people will actually stick to those numbers, I'm not sure, because you've still got an awful lot of fishing boats which are dependent on the trade, and the province still gets subsidies from the central government and all that kind of stuff. But they are taking an interest in actually trying to bring the catch down. Yes, they are valuable for fishing, absolutely, but overfishing will have potentially catastrophic consequences. You know, from a conservation point of view, the best thing to do is to draw a line around the Spratly Islands and basically declare it a fishing-free zone and allow the stocks to recover, you know, for the next few years. At the moment, between the 1st of May and 1st of August, I think it is, China imposes a fishing ban in the northern part of the South China Sea from a line just above the Spratly Islands to the Chinese coast, which on the face of it is a kind of sensible conservation measure. But they impose it unilaterally, and they punish the Vietnamese and the Philippines fishermen for fishing during that closed season. So they are asserting a claim in which the others, so the others therefore deliberately, or the governments deliberately send, or certainly the Vietnamese do, deliberately send their fishermen to go and fish in order to challenge the assertion of Chinese control. Yeah? And the fact that the ban doesn't exist below whatever latitude it is obliges the Chinese fishermen to go into the disputed waters to fish, and even closer into Indonesian waters. So this kind of nominal conservation measure is, in fact, you know, a contributor to the disputes in that sense.
My name is Paul Sweeney. I'm not a journalist. I'm a interested person. A couple of points. If the Philippines have gained a judgment against China in arbitration, and China ignores it and has ignored it, what is the worth of the international arbitration to resolve these kinds of disputes? Is there any worth to it? And second of all, as China continues to build on a scale not seen before these types of structures throughout the South China Sea, and continues to do so without ignoring the views of others, and has the power to do so, and the only power to potentially stop them, the US chooses not to. What do you see? Do you see this continuing indefinitely? And if so, what is the tipping point at which the US, you think, would intervene? And finally, how do you see this working out, resolving itself?
I think there's something kind of interesting going on with that tribunal ruling. Let's go back. So this is what Wang Yi said the day the ruling was announced. You know, and he talked about the ruling being a piece of waste paper, and that China would ignore it, and all the rest of it. And he basically told a whole load of lies, really. And he obviously hadn't even read paragraph 8 of the ruling, because he said, you know, it challenges China's territorial claims, whereas paragraph 8 of the ruling clearly says we're not asking this tribunal to rule on the territorial claims. So China would deliberately misrepresented the nature of the ruling in its public comments. But since then, it has, in my view, begun to comply with the ruling, despite its anti-tribunal rhetoric. So on the Scarborough Shoal, China has these kind of fishing boats that never actually do any fishing, because they are in fact covers for the maritime militia, and they were around Scarborough Shoal, and they were keeping the Philippine fishermen away. But at some point, you know, Duterte went to Beijing in October, and they came to an arrangement, and China has allowed Philippine fishermen to return to fish at the Scarborough Shoal. Not everywhere, not entirely uninterrupted, but it is some measure of compliance. China has not drilled for oil in the wrong places. China has not cut the survey cables of other countries' oil survey ships. China has, in several parts of the ruling, already complied. Now, that's not to say it's in compliance. For example, that fishing ban is probably a violation of the tribunal. The occupation of Mischief Reef, the the tribunal said that that was part of the Philippines continental shelf and that China shouldn't have built on it. No, China isn't going to give up a 3-kilometre long runway. It's going to remain in violation of that part of the ruling for the next 50 years. So it's a kind of mixed picture, I think. But I think the real turning point for some of China's behaviour was 2014 with the standoff with Vietnam over the Paracel Islands. Since then, their behaviour changed. It became much more moderate. It became much more focused on the island building and much less about kind of freelancing, individual ships or government agencies going off and doing their own bit to assert the national claim. It became much more coherent under Xi's management. So you're right, the judgment in itself has no, it is mandatory, it is in theory enforceable, but it's only enforceable if somebody is willing to risk the lives of sailors or whatever to actually go and enforce it. The Security Council obviously isn't going to pass any kind of resolutions about it because China has a veto, and Russia would probably join in. So, but nonetheless, if there was a particular alignment of forces, I mean, if Hillary Clinton had won the White House and somebody else had won the Philippines presidency, you could easily have seen the Philippines going to drill for gas and saying that any threat to a Philippine naval ship would incur the US-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty, and the 7th Fleet is just over there. That could have happened. It ain't going to happen now. But I imagine at some point the tribunal ruling will be produced privately between the Philippines and China, and we'll see what happens. Sorry, I've thought, what was the... Go on.
If China continues at the same rate that they're going at, and the US doesn't intervene, at what point will the US intervene, or will someone intervene? How will it end?
It's an interesting point, and the fact that we haven't seen freedom of navigation operations so far in the Trump presidency. I mean, the whole point about the freedom of navigation operations is they are not intended to challenge island building or China's territorial claims. They are supposed to challenge violations in the American eyes of laws of the sea, i.e. claiming rights that are not written down in UNCLOS, for example, saying that this underwater feature is in fact an island and claiming a zone around it. That's what they're supposed to claim. That's what the freedom of navigation operations are supposed to do. So, I mean, the other claimants fear that China just intends to just build up its presence, its forces, until, in effect, it's in de facto control. But they are equally adamant that they're not going to do so. The Vietnamese are buying submarines and anti-ship cruise missiles and everything else to kind of try and back up the idea that they would be prepared to fight for their islands. I mean, I have no doubt that the very long-term aim from the Chinese side is for all of the islands and features and reefs to return to Chinese control at some point. Yet, Chinese basically haven't done, they have refrained from any act of force in terms of, kind of reoccupying any of the islands since 1988. I mean, they could easily, and they could take over the Philippine-held islands in an afternoon if they wanted to. They'd have a bit more of a difficult fight with the Vietnamese. But China does occupy does kind of have some restraint in its behavior. I mean, it tried to starve out the Philippine Marines on that rusting ship, by putting a blockade around them, hoping that they would then leave and that they would then occupy the island straight away. But they obviously, had a line beyond which they wouldn't cross, which was the use of physical force against those 5 Marines. So yeah, so China does accept, I think, some limits on its behavior. Nonetheless, I think it will seek any way it can to advance its position against the other claimants.
Bill, as loath as I am to bring up ASEAN,
my exciting topic.
Does ASEAN have any capability? Do the regional powers and this bloc particularly have any capability to solve this diplomatically, or has China comprehensively bought off key members? Has divide and rule essentially dealt a death blow to ASEAN being able to do anything from this? And pre-Cambodia's 2012 switch, did the bloc play a role? Yeah,
I think it did. I mean, it had. it was responsible 15 years ago, let's not forget, for drawing up the original draft code of conduct, which became known as the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the, in the South China Sea, the DOC. And it basically, it followed, I mean, in effect, the Philippines was set the agenda. So after 1994, the Ramos government in the Philippines called for regional solidarity. We've all got to stand together to face down the China threat. And ASEAN invited Vietnam to join ASEAN even before Vietnam had applied for membership, as a kind of deliberate sign of kind of, regional solidarity on this question. So Ramos called for everybody to work together to sort of stand up against China. And then the next government that came in under Arroyo basically told ASEAN to go back to bed and try to cut a bilateral deal with Beijing. One of the key people in that joint development stuff was a guy called Jose de Venecia, who has suddenly popped up out of the woods to start talking about the same thing again with the Duterte administration. So then we had the Aquino administration, who said, no, everybody, stand together against China. And then we have Duterte now saying, no, everybody back to bed. We're going to do a bilateral deal. So it's not surprising that ASEAN's patience on this with the Philippines is wearing a bit thin. I mean, take Brunei, for example. Brunei never says anything about the South China Sea publicly, yet they kind of support the main thrust of ASEAN's previous opinions. Because of Cambodia's friendly relations with China, it's, the chances of getting any kind of unanimous criticism of China now is almost nil, really. But nonetheless, ASEAN, in the 2014 Paracels standoff, I think, okay, ASEAN only released a piece of paper, but it was a significant piece of paper because up until that point, ASEAN had stayed out of the Paracel dispute, seeing it as a purely bilateral Vietnamese-Chinese issue. They did take a step forward by saying this is a matter for all of Southeast Asia. But you're right, everyone is now going bilateral. The Philippines is going straight to Beijing. The Vietnamese are talking, using Communist Party channels to talk to Beijing. Malaysia is talking to Beijing, Brunei. So, the kind of all the key players are really, kind of given up on ASEAN, I think, in that sense. I mean, there are ongoing discussions about the code of conduct, but basically the Southeast Asian claimants want a code of conduct to limit China's behavior. China does not want a code of conduct that limits its behavior. Yeah, so there isn't going to be an agreement. Yeah, so unless you can find some magic formula whereby China thinks it's it's not being limited and ASEAN does. But anyway, who's going to enforce it? What kind of enforcement mechanism could there possibly be? Because China isn't going to allow some referral to the UN Security Council, for example. The other point of dispute is that China wants to basically draw a line around the Spratly Islands and say the code of conduct will only apply there, whereas the Philippines wants it also to apply to Scarborough Shoal. Vietnam wants it also to apply to the Paracel Islands. In some ways, the fact that China is prepared to draw a line around the Spratlys and say this is where the dispute is a kind of step back from saying, the whole U-shaped line is where the dispute is. So in some senses it's good, but the other ASEAN countries aren't going to go with it. So we've had the DOC in 2002. Was it 2012? We had the guidelines on the implementation of the DOC. I think we're now up to the draft framework for a code of conduct. Then maybe we'll have a framework for a code of conduct, but we aren't going to have a code of conduct because ultimately, editorializing here, China wants to build on the Scarborough Shoal, the third point of the triangle. Where are we? Let's go back to this. That's what we assume that that's China's eventual strategic aim in the South China Sea. Yeah. So they aren't going to sign a piece of paper that prevents them from doing that until they've done it. I think that's their long-term game.
I think that's the end of the question. So, Bill, thank you. One more.
Right. I've obviously said something wrong, provocative.
Hello, I have heard, I want to continue with the question related to the role of ASEAN in solving somehow ASEAN can hopefully solve the problem of South China Sea dispute. So turning back to not some months ago, but some weeks ago, I think, in their minister meeting in Manila, Philippines, you can see like Duterte really inclined into China. So at that time, there are so many papers they discussed about the unfavorable conditions for Vietnam at that time, because whether we agree with CLC or not, we still in trouble in claiming our their territory in Spratly and the two islands. So, but from that, when I follow the stories, I want to. Today I want to hear from the perspective, like whether they can have from the Vietnamese side, they can have any possibilities to claim and to somehow keep their territory on the two islands, to claim their East Vietnamese Sea or not. Thank you very much.
Whether you think the Vietnamese can get back all of the islands they claim, is that your question? Whether I think it's likely?
Yes, because in some analysis they say that okay, whether Vietnam agree with COC or not, because in Chinese perspective they think okay, you mentioned about 1988, their dispute, and at that time from Chinese perspective they agree that okay, that island belongs to us. Vietnam has no responsibility and no right to claim on it.
Yeah.
From Vietnam,
I mean, I don't see. If your question is, will any of the Southeast Asian claimants try to use force to get their islands back? I think the answer, the chances are minimal. Almost none, frankly. Was that what you were asking? I mean, the position of the Chinese naval forces and everything else is just far too strong for any country to try to initiate anything against them, really. So I think practically all these governments are reconciled to, the best outcome is the status quo, and they are concerned. The Southeast Asian countries are concerned about losing, islands or rocks to China.
So somehow the possibility of Vietnam, they have to agree with COC is like dominant.
Well, I mean, no, but I think the Vietnamese will try to push for a COC which is binding on China's behaviour, even if they are aware that it's very unlikely to happen. I think the process of discussing is always very important for ASEAN, because they don't wish to actively humiliate or criticise China. They want, they will kind of, go to great lengths to kind of make it look as if China is helping in this process, even if it isn't, because of the diplomatic niceties. They don't want to kind of all, gang up on China. They want to praise China for its constructive contributions to regional peace. So hence they'll agree a draft framework, because it looks like it's a step towards where they're going, even if they all know that it's a charade.
So, last question.
Yeah.
So, this year is the Duterte chairman, but next year will be Singaporean.
Sorry, say again?
This year is the Duterte chairman.
Oh, right, okay.
But next year will be Singaporean. But I think coming soon, the leader Singaporean, they will visit China. It means somehow like, okay, the Singaporean, they favor in the Chinese way. So what can you predict in the next coming year?
Did you notice that Singapore didn't get invited to the Belt and Road Forum? China thinks Singapore's a very naughty boy at the moment.
Oh, thank you. I haven't updated that. Thank you.
That's why the Singaporean armoured vehicles had a bit of a detour on their way back from Taiwan, because the Chinese wanted to make a point that they shouldn't be doing military training in Taiwan. Was there one?
Hi, I've got one more question about freedom of navigation. Frequently, the United States gets, like tonight, you mentioned the United States, their desire to test freedom of navigation pretty much anywhere around the world. And it's not just the United States, from what I understand. When you comment on other regional powers, like I've read recently that Australia, for example, is more interested than the United States is at times in exercising its rights. How about other countries?
Okay, so the US has had a formal freedom of navigation program since 1979, and it produces an annual report. And it's not just China, it's Brazil, it's India. In the South China Sea, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia all have domestic laws which, in the view of the US, conflict with the law of the sea. Now, some of them are simply things like in Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, it's that foreign navies should notify the government when they're going to sail through the exclusive economic zone. And the US says that's not in UNCLOS, we refuse to notify it, so therefore they deliberately sail through without telling anybody, just to stick the fingers up at, at these rules. China has slightly, there are other issues that it engages with about China. There are, in theory, all signatories to UNCLOS should be sticking up for freedom of navigation, but only really those countries with, strong navies are prepared to actually do anything about it. So the Australians they do mainly flights flying out of Butterworth. I always like this map because it kind of makes clear the Chinese predicament. They are surrounded by islands. But Australian planes flying out of Butterworth fly out over here, and when they're challenged, my BBC colleague Rupert Wingfield-Hayes happened to hear an Australian flight being challenged by the Chinese, and the Australians basically saying, this is international airspace, we fly where we want. Britain doesn't have a navy at the moment, but we put 2 helicopters on a French naval ship, and we sent it through the South China Sea as a gesture of solidarity recently. And last October, when we sent some Eurofighter Typhoons to Korea and Japan, they made a point of flying over the Scarborough Shoal, I'm told. But unlike the Americans, we told the Chinese we were coming first, just so they didn't shoot us down or any other unpleasantness. But that was our gesture towards freedom of navigation. And the French sail around, and other people. So yeah, there are other countries doing it. And the important thing, I think, is that the freedom of navigation is supposed to be a neutral thing, so that it doesn't matter whether you're in some kind of geopolitical dispute with the US or not. It's about saying, this is our interpretation of the law of the sea. Maybe we'll write you a letter. Maybe we'll sell an aircraft carrier through your neighborhood, depending on the circumstances. It's not supposed to be, we disagree with your policy of building artificial islands, so therefore we're going to kind of wave a big stick at you. And so long as that's made clear to everybody, then that should be fine. The problem is that it becomes politicized, and it was politicized under the previous administration.
Should we have a last question?
Yes, just a question, sir. You have shown a triangle, red triangle with a deep sea.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, so you tell us that the submarine from the Chinese army want to hide there, to be hidden in the place there. So presently the capabilities of the ultrasonic signal systems used by the boat in France and by submarines in the US are able to reach about 100 kilometers. Is it the range of the triangle?
Yeah, I think this is kind of where we're heading, really, is these kind of very secret games of exactly what submarines can and can't do, and where the listening devices are placed. And part of the point of this is that, assuming that this is the strategy, is that if it comes to some kind of confrontation, then you use your ships and your helicopters based here to try and keep out the submarines and the surface warfare ships from this area, and try and push them away so you can hide in here. Yes. If you just have a submarine on its own, it's quite vulnerable. It has to operate with its own protection force and everything else around it. So the assumption is that there would be missiles on here to keep out American planes and helicopters. There would be ships deployed in the area, but obviously not all the time, only in the sense that, if this comes to be some great world war crisis type thing. We're not assuming that China would want to kind of close this sea permanently. That would obviously be a major threat to international navigation. But should there be some kind of political crisis where the Chinese leadership felt itself under threat, then this would be its survival strategy. That's the assumption.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've heard a retired U.S. admiral say recently just about that, that it's no big deal, at least for the United States, because if the Chinese did do that, then we could get the trade routes, et cetera, and move them. It's kind of like you mentioned about the U.S. aircraft carrier moving around the Philippines and to the east of it. Just do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's further, and I mean, when you actually start, I mean, but then you kind of have to go through either through the Philippines archipelagic waters or the Indonesian ones, or you have to go further south. I don't think you can get an aircraft carrier. I don't think it's deep enough to go between Indonesia and Australia, so you have to kind of go around the bottom end of Australia. So I think it's, yes, you're right, but it adds costs and times to deployments, and also we just get hung up on the principle that it's an impediment to freedom of navigation. We hold the line on this question, and therefore we have to demonstrate our capabilities. Yeah. Mm.
Well, look, Bill, thank you very much for that talk. So a reminder, there are Bill's South China Sea book is available for sale at the back, and it's at a slightly reduced price. So if you're interested in it,
thank you.
Go for it.
There's a joke in chapter 8.
Stay around for drinks, and if you're not a member, do please sign up. Events are free if you're a member, and we still remain one of the cheapest FCCs in Asia. And we put on fantastic talks. Yeah. So, thanks very much.
Thank you for having me.